Thanks to Kristen Welker as well. Let's go back to Trump's phone call to Putin, the target of scathing criticism as well from the former director of the CIA. Here's John Brennan on Morning Joe today.
To congratulate him and to treat him so nicely while he treats Americans with such disdain, I think it just demonstrates that he looks at the world through a prism of what is going to help and protect Donald Trump. That is not what presidents are supposed to do.
Do you believe he's somehow in debt to the president of Russia?
I think he's afraid of the president of Russia.
Why?
Well, I think one can speculate as to why. That the Russians may have something on him personally that they could always roll out and make his life more difficult.
Philip Rucker is White House bureau chief for the Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst. Barry McCaffrey, a retired four-star general and NBC military analyst. Carol Leonnig is a Washington Post reporter and an MSNBC contributor. Let me start with you, Carol, and tell us more about this report in your newspaper. What specifically were you folks told about this phone call and about the advice that the president was given by his national security team?
So what we were told is what we reported in the paper yesterday, which is that the president, as is often the case when he's going to have a call with a foreign leader, was given some guidance in written materials, was given some oral guidance as well about how he should steer this conversation. That's not abnormal. It's very typical for the president to get some sort of pre-brief for each of these meetings and any kind of contact with a foreign official. In this instance, the materials indicated to the president, please do not congratulate Putin on his election victory. There were also encouragements to the president to speak about a couple of hot-button issues. Among them was the poisoning of a Russian double agent in the UK in Salisbury. The president did not bring up that poisoning with President Putin, and he did congratulate him on the election victory. This caused quite a stir, a kerfuffle immediately after the call ended, and part of that is how we learned about it.
Well, there's that part of it, that it got leaked at all. What can you tell us? Is it possible that, as has been suggested, that it's illegal to leak this kind of information? Obviously, if the president or his chief of staff finds out who did it, they could fire whoever it is if that's what they wanted to do. But was the law potentially broken?
I think what's important to focus on here is the 1-2 pow of what's happened. There is the president who is under scrutiny by the special counsel because of the ties between the Russian government and apparently between advisors in his campaign. A lot of outreach from the Russians to his campaign. On the other hand, you have the national security team and very likely the intelligence team as well, encouraging the president not to cheer on a victory in an election that appears to have been rigged in Russia. And the president chose his own path. That is what he's allowed to choose. But it is the combination that has people so stirred up. Why is it that the president so frequently wants to buddy up with Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, General, before this call with Putin even happened, you were concerned. You tweeted that Trump was a serious threat to U.S. national security and under the sway of Mr. Putin. What's your thinking now? I mean, what do you make of what we've learned over the last 12, 15 hours or so?
It's an astonishing situation. By the way, those presidential talking points between heads of state come out of the interagency community. So State Department, CIA, Defense, Justice, all would have weighed in on them. So when they're looking for the leaker to the Washington Post, they better cast their net pretty broadly. It would have come finally out of the National Security Advisor to the President. But look, you know, there's nothing illegal about saying what we've been saying for the last week. Don't congratulate this dictator. He didn't just rig the election, he murdered and prosecuted the likely opposition. Putin is an obvious threat to NATO interests. He's trying to break up the European Union, hacking our elections, hacking into the power grid. We actually had an armed conflict between so-called Russian mercenaries in Syria attacking U.S. forces in the last several days. So it's just astonishing behavior by the President of the United States to make this phone call? What is going on?
So do you agree with John Brennan that it looks like possibly this is about the Russians having something on President Trump?
Well, I don't know, Chris.
I'm sorry, General?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's knowable. Something bizarre has happened where the President of the United States, who's the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and our intelligence community, is not defending U.S. national interests. Why is he doing that?
It was interesting to listen to Garrett Haake, Phil, talking about the one thing that brings Republicans and Democrats together, and that being their distaste. And you might use even a harsher word for Vladimir Putin. I want to play for you what Senator Marco Rubio had to say about all this.
Only a handful of people in the White House could have possibly known both about the call and what was said and the notes that were prepared for him. And my view of it is, if you're leaking stuff, it's to hurt him. And if you're trying to hurt him, it's because you don't like him or you don't agree with him. Why are you still there? Frankly, if you don't like the guy, quit, leave.
Phil, what does a leak like this tell us about what's going on at the highest levels of government?
Well, with all respect to the senator, he wasn't in that room, so I don't know that he can speak necessarily to where this leak might have come from, and we obviously can't discuss that. But it does speak to a concern. I know Trump has been bothered by this. He's been bothered in the past by these sorts of leaks. At the Washington Post, we reported early on in the presidency about his very contentious phone call with the Prime Minister of Australia, and the president was very bothered by that. And you know, he tries to sort of figure out where these leaks are coming from, but they continue, and they continue, by the way, in all manner, not just on national security matters, but you know, our reporting and reporting at other outlets has shown time and again details about the president's mood, about what the president is telling his advisors and his friends in private. Just lots of information coming out to paint a really full picture that is important, frankly, for the American public to learn about this president and the way he's making decisions.
An important part of that is how he approaches things like this. And so is it clear, Phil, if the president ignored those capital letters that said "do not congratulate," or he just didn't read it or hear it?
Well, all we know is what Carol and my other colleagues reported, which is that he was advised in those capital letters not to congratulate Putin, and he went on in his phone call with President Putin to do the opposite, to congratulate him and then not to confront him on the poison attack. So, you know, I don't know if he willfully ignored that or why he made that decision, but that's what happened.
Yeah, General, the other thing is really when something like this happens, how it's viewed. Consistency in foreign policy is obviously very critical. Sarah Sanders was pressed on this at a very brief White House briefing yesterday, and she said the White House doesn't dictate how other countries operate, but they've condemned Venezuela and Cambodia over their elections. Just a couple of days ago, they had this statement criticizing Iran over its record on voting rights and cyber attacks. What do you make, at the very least here, of what is an inconsistent approach?
Well, it's bizarre. And who needs talking points to understand that you don't call Putin and congratulate him on an election that was so clearly not in the interest of the Russian people in terms of democracy? I mean, it isn't the leak, it's the fact that the President of the United States, for some reason, will call essentially a guy, Putin, running a criminal oligarchy in Russia, and fail to say, you've got to stop murdering your opposition people in the UK. And by the way, they probably killed that Russian citizen in New York City also. Why would the president not instinctively look up for American interests? What is causing him to be under the sway of Putin? And by the way, other strongmen, Xi and Duterte in the Philippines and Erdogan in Turkey, and why is he hostile to Democratic leaders, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Angela Merkel in Germany, etc.? This doesn't make any sense. He is not protecting U.S. national interests.
Yeah, you know, Phil, one of the things that struck me is a lot of folks who even are concerned about the president but want to put a note of caution will talk about the solid people who are around him, you know, that he has people who are going to advise him. And obviously, in this case, he either didn't see it or didn't hear it. It also, I think, leads to the question that has been talked about a lot lately about who wants to go to work for Donald Trump. Clearly, somebody high up, or at least with access to this kind of information, leaked this. Lawyers like Ted Olson say they don't want to go to work for him. People who are working for him have been under fire just in the last 24 hours. Ben Carson threw his wife under the bus over that $31,000 dining room set. Betsy DeVos took a beating at another congressional hearing after not being able to answer questions about schools on 60 Minutes. There are these new reports about Scott Pruitt spending massive amounts of money on flights. So what does this mean going forward? I mean, you can never look at this in sort of one place. I mean, there's a bigger question here about functionality at the White House.
That's right, and it all paints a portrait of chaos, frankly, in the White House and within the federal government, and it stems from the way that the president chooses to manage and to lead his team, to lead his cabinet, to lead his White House staff. There are vacancies throughout the White House and throughout the senior levels of the government, especially at the State Department right now, that have gone unfilled, in part because of an inability to recruit top-notch talent and retain them. So that's been a problem for this administration. But, you know, with regards to Putin, the Republicans on the Hill have been saying all along, you know, it's okay, it's okay. We trust that the generals, the people advising the president, are going to steer him in the right direction. Well, what happened yesterday is they did try to steer him in that direction, and he chose to go a different direction. And he's the president. He's entitled to make that choice. But it doesn't mean that just because John Kelly is the chief of staff, you know, somehow these decisions are going to stay within the mainstream of what's considered acceptable in America in the minds of many on Capitol Hill.
Or that despite his best efforts, he's going to be able to keep them from leaking, as we've seen. Philip Rucker, thank you. General Barry McCaffrey, always great to see you. And once again, great reporting. Carol Leonnig, thank you. With the hashtag Where's Zuck picking up steam on Twitter, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is now set to speak sometime within the next 24 hours as questions continue about how Facebook is protecting user data and lawmakers are demanding answers. And the president locked in a legal battle